So, for Bill at least, the Rockefeller thing was a bust. All of Bill's grand plans for alcoholic hospitals and paid missionaries went out the window. Sure, there was $5,000 waiting at a church for Dr. Bob, but how was that money going to get to him? The church wasn't going to write Bob monthly checks. So, Bill and Hank came up with another idea. How about starting a foundation? One that looks like the Rockefeller Foundation, to make us look respectable, and then hound rich people for money that way. Now, a foundation costs a lot of money to set up, and Bill and Hank had no money. So Hank floated the idea of creating an alcoholic fund to get started, which would simply be a bank account so that they'd have the ability to distribute the Rockefeller money to Dr. Bob and take in more money as time went on. Willard Richardson and Frank Amos were behind the idea 100%, and Frank Amos set up the bank account through Chase National Bank. The first transaction was for $500 to be sent to Dr. Bob. Hank said that the fund would only accept money from those who were directly helped by their program. And by directly helped, he didn't mean just drunks who got sober, but also they would accept donations from their wives, their family members, maybe their close friends, even the corporations that drunk worked for, and of course they'd be willing to accept money from the wealthy individuals and foundations, so technically the fund would accept money from anybody. In late spring of 1938, Hank and Bill go fundraising again, this time for the new alcoholic fund. But Bill and Hank found the same objections as they did before. Why would we want to help people who were bent on hurting themselves? No one gave a dime. Except one person, Charlie Towns, owner of Towns Hospital. He gave the fund a $500 donation, their first one. It was obvious that the hospital idea was dead, for now. So was the idea of paid missionaries. But Bill and Hank didn't want to give up, so it was time for Plan C, writing the big book. Remember, Bill's vision was to get the word out about this program of recovery to every drunk in America and to get them sober. Bill travels out to Akron to let them know he's going to write the book, but this time the Akron drunks resisted the book thing more than they did the hospital thing back in the fall. Their argument was, what if this book is a success and they get flooded with too many requests for help? How would we manage helping all those drunks? There are only like 50 of us right now. What structure do we have to help them all? Plus, a lot of people in Akron just felt Bill had ulterior motives. If we sell a book, that means we'll be profiting off this thing. And who's that money going to go to? You, Bill? So, naturally, the Akron vote was in the negative. Way negative. When Bill got to New York, however, he and Hank decided to take another vote with their people, the New York drunks, and their vote was very much in the affirmative. So, New York decided to overrule Akron and have Bill and Hank get started on the book. Hank calculated that they would need to fundraise about $15,000 for the book. That should cover, I don't know what it would cover, but that's what Hank thought it would cost. So, anyways, Bill and Hank go fundraising again, and sure enough, nothing. Oh, except for Charlie Towns, who gave another $500. Now, going to people and saying, hey, can you give us some money because we have this cure for alcoholism and we'd like to write a book about it, a book I really can't show you, wasn't going to work in even the best of circumstances. Hank realized this and realized it would be easier to raise money for this book if we had some chapters done first. That way they could send these chapters out as solicitation letters to really important people, and that would be a better way of getting the ball rolling on raising money. Bill agreed, and they got started. In May of 1938, Bill writes out the first two chapters of what will become our big book, Bill's Story, and There Is a Solution. Got those chapters done quickly, like in a month or so they were done. Hank Parkhurst wrote out the outline for the book, The Doctor's Opinion, There Is a Solution, and Bill's Story, more about alcoholism, We Agnostics, how it works and into action, working with others, to wives and the family afterward, to employers, a vision for you. You may notice some of these chapters are out of place, but I can assure you this was the original plan. With the chapters done, Hank and Bill create a master package. In it, they include the two chapters, along with the book's outline, and a plan for the book, and why they need money to write it, and the grand scheme for this proven cure for alcoholism, plus information about the fund they created, and the fact that they got a Rockefeller guy working with them. And to finish it off, they added, "Now, wouldn't you like to donate to the Alcoholism Fund and make this happen?" The package was foolproof. It was bound to bring in millions. In June of 1938, gobs of these packages, hundreds, were sent out to prominent people across the country. Doctors, scientists, judges, business people, foundations, rich people of all kind, as many as Bill and Hank could afford stamps for, which probably came from the money donated by Charlie Towns. And lo and behold, the people they sent these packages to responded. There were lots of responses, very positive responses, cheering them on in their efforts, but no one sent any donations, only well wishes. Darn. Bill and Hank were back where they started. During all this activity, Dr. Bob and the Akron people weren't informed that Bill and Hank were moving ahead with this book idea. Akron was completely in the dark. Not wanting to keep secrets from Bob, in late June of 1938, Bill finally realizes he needs to fess up, and he writes Bob to tell him he started writing the book and trying to raise money for it. We know that Bill was a fan of William James's essays on the varieties of religious experience, and one could assume Bill wanted the big book to be laid out in the same manner. In those books containing those essays, there are William James's lectures in the first part of the book, and then the personal conversion stories in the second part. If Bill was looking to do the same thing, he would need personal stories from recovered drunks. If this was going to be a united program, Bill was going to need stories from both New York and Akron. In that same letter, Bill put Bob in charge of collecting stories from the Akron drunks. Imagine what Bob was thinking when he got that letter. How could he tell Bill the boys already voted not to do this and then turn him down? I mean, Dr. Bob was secretly collecting checks from the Rockefellers, and no one in Akron knew that Dr. Bob was getting money for his services to alcoholics. So Bob kind of had to go along with this, right? Yeah. Now, Hank Parkhurst came up with the name Alcoholics Anonymous. A lot of names were being floated on what they should call the book, and Alcoholics Anonymous was the name Hank floated out there. I bring this up because in August of 1937, Bill and Hank and Frank Amos were ready to create the foundation. Frank Amos found a lawyer sympathetic to their cause. His name was John Wood, and he agreed to draw up the foundation's paperwork for free. When Bill wrote Bob again in August of 1938, informing him of the foundation, Bill wrote that he suggests naming the foundation Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the first time that name appears. In the end, they end up calling the foundation Alcoholic Foundation. The board for this foundation was to be made up of 5 members, 3 non-alcoholic members known as Class A trustees, and 2 alcoholic members known as Class B trustees. The main job for the trustees was to make sure the money collected by the Alcoholic Foundation was put to the proper purposes. The trustees make all the money decisions, okay? This is why everyone thought it would be best to have more non-alcoholic trustees than alcoholics. Because what if all the alcoholic trustees went out and started drinking again, right? What are they going to spend all that money on? So, along with the board of trustees, an advisory board was created, who wouldn't have decision-making power regarding the money, but would advise and consult with the board on matters, with all that stuff they do up in Tonopah that goes nowhere and just makes everyone really angry, That's the advisory board. That's what we send Jake to every year. Now, the first Class A trustees were Frank Amos, Willard Richardson, and John Wood, the lawyer who did all the paperwork. The first Class B trustees were Bill Rudell and Dr. Bob Smith. Bill and Hank would make up the first advisory board, along with some other people who I didn't write their names down. The first meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation was on August 11, 1937, in room 5600, where else? Rockefeller Center. Technically the first Founders Day, right? Dr. Bob was not in attendance. Now, it's important to point out that the entire purpose for the Alcoholic Foundation was to make us look more professional and respectable in the eyes of the rich and powerful, and the professional class of America, as we hound them for money to write the big book. The foundation was going to advocate for a cure for alcoholism. We're no longer going to be out there as a bunch of drunks just grifting for money. Oh no, we're a foundation now with legal paperwork and a proven cure that worked for 50 people so far. And we have a Rockefeller guy on the board too. So as a board of trustees, I mean, doesn't the foundation make us look more professional? Absolutely. More posh? After the first board meeting, we should mention Frank Amos provided AA with a huge solid. He wrote down everything that happened, all of his recollections, from the first Rockefeller dinner to the first meeting of the Alcoholic Foundation, and all the stuff that happened in between for posterity. He did it specifically to preserve the story of how this movement started. 8 pages of handwritten notes were preserved and tucked away long ago in GSO's archives, and thankfully it was discovered. There is verification, too, that his notes were passed to Bill and Hank for review. Because of this, we are able to pass along a much more accurate story of how AA got off the ground than the stories we've read in the past, even the ones in our own conference-approved literature. And we are grateful to Frank Amos for all his work in getting AA started. Also, we need to point out that Bill thought he should try to get in contact with Henry Ford, the legendary automaker. Ford was a notorious prohibitionist and even had a team of people spying on his workers in their private lives. If any one of Ford's employees were found to be drinking off the clock, even in their own homes, they were fired. Bill never was able to contact Henry Ford, but he really, really tried. Right? Moving forward. Okay, on August 30th, Dr. Bob comes to New York with Ann for a 3-day visit. They stayed with Bill and Lois in Brooklyn. During his stay, he was able to attend one of Bill's alcoholic meetings with the New York boys. By this time, the New York meeting resembled something vastly different than the Oxford group meeting in Akron. The New York meeting was far less religious in tone, and drunks spent a lot more time talking about their past drinking than reading scripture and listening for guidance like they do in Akron. It would be interesting to see what Dr. Bob's reaction to this meeting was like, but we have no record. What is on record, though, was that at that particular Tuesday night meeting that Dr. Bob attended, Hank brought in a reporter from the Reader's Digest to observe the meeting and maybe write a story about this movement. This is important. You'll need to remember that, okay? All right, anyways, even though the Rockefellers weren't going to be giving them money to start the hospital, Dr. Bob was still very hopeful in the idea of building one. That could be why Dr. Bob was willing to go along with Bill's wild plans this whole time. I mean, Bill did get Bob a check from the Rockefellers, right? And Bill got a foundation started. Maybe Bill could still make this hospital thing happen too, right? Yeah. So just before Dr. Bob came to New York, Bill got a late reply from one of those packages they sent out back in June from a police court judge in Washington, D.C. named Walter J. Casey, who was very interested in the idea of opening Bill and Bob's alcoholic hospital. As a police court judge, Walter Casey sees drunks in his court on a daily basis, repeat offenders, all right? The idea of a cure for alcoholism was intriguing to him, and Dr. Bob was elated at the news when Bill told him this. Fitz Mayo, the New York member who lived down in Washington, D.C., went to go speak to the judge and reported to Bill that the judge took fire to the idea right away and wanted to know what we proposed. So Bill caught the next train to D.C., right down. Bill and Fitz would spend 10 days going back and forth with the judge. They explained their cure, proposed raising funds to rent a house on the outskirts of town to get started. And did we mention we have a foundation that has a Rockefeller guy on our board of trustees? Well, guess what? We got one. The judge became very enthusiastic and said he should have no problem in raising the money for this experiment. The alcoholic hospital was a go. But it somehow all fell apart. The judge got really sick at the beginning of September, which put him in the hospital for a while. Plus, Fitz Mayo had to focus more on his business than the hospital thing because his financial situation wasn't that great. So it didn't happen. Yeah, they were close. Like, the judge's wealthy friends literally had their checkbooks ready to go. And then, poof, gone. Maybe 1 or 2 days more was all Bill needed. I'm sure it felt crappy delivering the news to Dr. Bob that the DC hospital thing was off. Dr. Bob was really looking forward to it. I bring this up because imagine if Bill and Bob did get their hospital. What would AA be like today if that happened? Right? With the DC hospital thing dead and the fundraising a total failure, Bill got back to writing more of the book. In late September of 1938, Bill and Lois traveled to Stepping Stones in upstate New York. Up there, he was able to complete the chapters More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics. Ruth Huck, the secretary for Honor Dealers. Remember that business that I told you, that we told you about? Honor Dealers? Well, Ruth Huck was the secretary, and she is now serving as the typist for Bill Wilson, all right? She was up in Stepping Stones as well, and she would be responsible for typing out all of the big book and would eventually serve as AA's first secretary. So, at this point, everyone is broke. Bill has no money, none, and Hank and Fitz are in the same boat. The Honor Dealers thing was in the tank, and Fitz's closing business was losing money. The Alcoholic Foundation had no money either. Bill and Hank's plan was to have the book be a self-published venture where the profits from the book would go to fund the hospitals and the missionaries. But where was that money going to come from? Nobody was donating to the foundation. The trustees started to suggest, nay, demand, that the alcoholic members begin to pay monthly dues to cover some of the foundation's cost. But Bill and Hank knew that wasn't possible. He wrote an impassioned letter to Frank Amos stating that we three have sold our sheep and goats. There is no money. So, in hopes of trying to solve the money problems, Frank Amos suggests looking for a publisher who might give them an advance on the book. Bill and Hank received a lot of positive responses from those packages they sent out back in June, a lot of them from very prominent people. Perhaps all those positive responses might interest a publisher in the book. And sure enough, Frank was right. Harper Publishing wanted in. They offered an advance of $1,500 for the rights to the book and 10% royalties after the book was published. But Harper stated that the 10% royalties wouldn't kick in until after 5,000 copies of the book sold first. The book was sold for $3 a pop. That would mean only a 30-cent profit per book, and they would need to sell 5,000 copies of the book first before they could see that 30 cents. How were Bill and Hank going to fund their hospitals and paid missionaries with only 30 cents per book? So Hank crunched the numbers. If it costs less than $1 to print a book and they sell the book for $3, that's at least a $2 profit. So 30 cents versus $2, well, the answer was clear. And Bill and Hank said no thank you. But when Bill and Hank told the trustees about the $1,500 advance from Harper Publishing, it was music to their ears. There was some hope for this thing after all. But Bill and Hank already said no to the Harper Publishing deal. Bill and Hank, however, were not the decision makers on the money in the Alcoholic Foundation. The trustees were. And the trustees were like, excuse me, you go back there and get that frickin' check. We make the decisions on the money, not you. And Bill went back to the publisher, all right, and he got Harper Publishing to pull their offer. Then Bill and Hank go back to the trustees and say, well, we spoke to the publishers and now the offer is dead, so we're stuck having to self-publish. Wah, wah. And the board was like, oh, no, we're not. Go back there and fix it. And Bill and Hank were like, oh, yes, we are publishing. And the board was like, oh, no, we're not. And anyways, that's how the publisher thing went. So, now Bill was able to get some money, though. Enter Charlie Towns again. Charlie understands this alcoholic thing has to be 100% separate from his hospital, so he offers Bill a deal. Charlie will loan Bill $300 a month for the next 5 months to get the book finished, $200 of which would go to Bill, and the other $100 would go to Ruth Huck to type it up, girl typing the book. And the foundation can pay it back whenever. The total amount of the loan came out to $1,500, the same value as the advance from Harper Publishing. So Bill was able to find an advance from somewhere, and the board approved it. They were like, we like that idea. Boom, go ahead, do whatever you want. So now that Bill has a few dollars coming in, for now, they still need to raise money to self publish the book. The foundation was set up to make them look respectable to all the hoity toities and try to get some money out of them, but no one was donating anything. So Bill and Hank came up with decided to try a new method to raise funds. Profit. That's right. Why not raise money by selling shares in a publishing company of their own, one they'll call the 100 Men Corporation. So they went to a stationery store and bought a pad of blank stock certificates. Ruth types on the certificates, 100 Men Corporation, par value $25. Then Hank signed each certificate, confidently. Hank G. Parkhurst, President. Of course, this just validated Akron's worst fears about Bill's plans. But Bill and Hank were getting desperate. When Bill told Bob about the plan, Bob replied, "It would be unwise at this stage to lay this matter before the Akron membership." Right. Hank figured they would need to sell at least 200 shares of stock in the company to finance a first run of the book. That's $5,000. What wasn't said was that another 200 shares were to be held by Hank and Bill as compensation for all the work that they put into the book thing, making 400 shares total. Shady stuff there. Anyways, Hank predicted that if they sell 15,000 copies of the book, that would generate a $10 dividend per share, plus you'd recoup your initial $25 investment. And if 100,000 copies of the book were sold, that would be a $150 dividend per share. There were no articles of incorporation or board of directors or anything. Just sell the shares and figure out everything else later. Bill and Hank then try selling the shares of the fellas in AA, promoting it as a once-in-a-lifetime ground floor opportunity that they would be crazy not to miss. The New York drunks laughed at them. It was the Great Depression, and newly sober alcoholics already had a hard time keeping their own obligations in order. Coming up with $25 just wasn't going to happen. No one was buying. But then a little surprise dropped in Hank and Bill's lap. Remember that reporter who visited the AA meeting back when Dr. Bob was in town? Well, he called Hank with some good news. Reader's Digest was interested in doing a story on their little alcoholic movement and would be willing to publish a story about them when the book was ready. Why, this is firecracker information. National publicity from a Reader's Digest article about a cure for alcoholism would make their book fly off the shelves. So Hank came up with a new sales pitch. He drew up a beautiful looking prospectus, including a corporate setup and a company budget, potential return on investment, the marketing strategy, and of course, the promise of the Reader's Digest article. Plus, a financing option for buying shares. $5 a month, no interest. The promise of a Reader's Digest article, as well as the payment plan, began moving some shares. 43 people signed on, buying 179 shares. The ball was rolling. Up at Stepping Stones, Bill Wilson continues writing. In the months of October and November, Bill writes Working with Others, To Wives, The Family Afterward, and A Vision for You. Hank Parkhurst writes the chapter To Employers, along with a Q&A chapter where Hank would hypothesize questions people may have about Alcoholics Anonymous and then provide answers for them. The Q&A chapter would get cut from the final draft, and apparently Hank was not happy about it. By December of 1937, Bill had written all the chapters about alcoholism for the book. Now it was crunch time. He had to put on paper the actual program of recovery, the how it works and into action chapters, and he needed some steps, something so airtight that an alcoholic wouldn't be able to wiggle out, no matter how hard he tried. Play recording. Now that Bill had his steps as a ready-made outline for a program of recovery, he spent the rest of December finishing the last 2 chapters of the book, How It Works and Into Action. At the end of December, the first 164 pages of the big book were done. In January of 1939, the board of Alcoholics Anonymous approved of the book, along with Bill and Hank's plan for raising money to get the book printed, something they decided not to tell the foundation until then. Some of the board members even bought a few shares. Plus, Dr. Bob came to New York again, where another nose count was made, Akron having about 75 redeemed alcoholics and New York having about 60. Tom Uzzell served as the Big Book's editor, along with a lady named Janet Blair, who I think was the proofreader. Tom Uzzell's edits didn't deal with the words or the tone of the program of the book. He made mechanical edits. Like, you can only fit so many words on a page. And if you can only afford this many pages to fit 11 chapters in, then this chapter must be broken down to this many words, and that chapter must be broken down to that many words, and so on. That's what Tom did. As an example, Bill's original version of There Is a Solution that he turned into Tom was 5,400 words long, but in the multilith copy, it's only 3,616 words. That's a 37% reduction. This 37% reduction of There Is a Solution wasn't because there were parts of the chapter that were bad or redundant. It's because there were only X amount of pages that could hold X amount of words. So 37% of There Is a Solution wasn't going to fit, and it had to go. And because they can only afford to have the first 164 pages edited by a professional, the personal stories were going to be edited by Hank Parkhurst. A lot of people in New York didn't like this idea, and the Akron people probably left in the dark about it completely altogether, but that's what happened. All right, so 100 Men changes to Works Publishing. Sometime in February of 1938, the 100 Men company changed its name to Works Publishing. None of the shareholders were consulted on this. Bill and Hank made the decision on their own, being that they were the majority shareholders, right? They had the 200 shares. In the book Pass It On, the author states that the name came from the Akron people because Ann Smith's favorite Bible quote was "Faith without works is dead." But there is no information to corroborate that story, and in fact, when Bill and Hank changed the name to Works Publishing, Akron didn't know that Bill had the publishing company and was selling shares in the first place. According to Bill Wilson, the name came from the idea that this book would be the first of many great works we would do, and that's why he called it Works Publishing. Okay, so now that the book is done, what's going to be the book's title, right? There were many names floated. Haven, 100 Men, The Dry Way, The Empty Glass, etc. Tons of names. But the two finalists came down to The Way Out and Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill and Hank were heavily in favor of the name Alcoholics Anonymous, but by a narrow margin, the New York group voted for The Way Out as the title of the book. Not wanting to give up the fight, Bill asked Fitz Mayo in D.C. to go visit the Library of Congress and find out how many different books had the title The Way Out versus Alcoholics Anonymous. Fitz telegrammed Bill, and it goes, 25 books titled The Way Out, 12 books titled The Way, 9 books titled This Way Out, and none titled Alcoholics Anonymous. And with that telegram, Bill and Hank won the day. The title of the book was going to be Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, what about this multilith, right? Well, the idea was raised by someone that a pre-publication copy of the book should be made for doctors and psychiatrists and judges and priests and ministers to review. Maybe the book contains some medical errors or material that would offend different religions and such. Multilith is a brand name, like Xerox is today. So back then, if someone said, I made a multilith of your pages, it would be the equivalent of somebody today saying, I Xeroxed a copy of your pages. The multilith process works by taking a photo of your pages, then burning that photo onto a printing plate, and it's usually good for about 100 copies of the page. Around 300 multilith copies of the book were produced, and probably not all at the same time. It happened in stages as Bill and Hank could afford them. We don't know how much it cost to have the multiliths made, but we do know that some of them were sold. As in, you give us $3.50 in advance for a copy of the book, and we'll send you this 165-page multilith copy first for you to read and write your notes on. Then you send this multi-lith copy back to us, and we'll send you the final book when we print it. This will become controversial. And this image here of the cover of the multi-lith from the book that started it all, the original working manuscript of AA, you'll see a loaned copy stamp on it. The first run of the multi-lith copies did not have this loaned copy stamp on them, meaning the first 164 pages were sent out without any copyright protection. I don't know the semantics of all of that, but because there are proof of sales thingies out there with the multi-lith, which predates the publication of the big book, and those multi-lith copies were sent out without markings stating that the multi-lith was not the final copy, this becomes one of the wrenches in the story of why AA World Service does not have a copyright on the first 164 pages of the big book. That means anyone, anywhere, can use the 12 steps for whatever they want, because AA doesn't own them. Darn. All right, so on Monday, February 20th, 1939, or thereabouts, the first multi-lith copies get distributed. Bill travels to Akron with the multi-liths to see what the Akron people think of the book. And, to his great relief, the Akron people approve. Greatly. They love the book. This was a huge relief for Bill. But then Bill tells the Akron people how the printing of the book was being financed. And it was Akron's worst fears come true. When Bill attempted to get the Akron members to buy shares in Works Publishing, all hell broke loose. Stock meant money, and even worse, profits. Bill's sales job boiled over into a furor. Look at what these New York boys are doing to our simple program. They're just trying to line their pockets. It was a mess. Bill was getting it from all corners of the room. But remember, the people in Akron are also clueless that Dr. Bob is getting checks from the Rockefellers, all right? As a credit to Bill's character, when he was getting the once-over from the Akron people at that meeting, he could have told the Akronites that Dr. Bob was getting monthly checks as a way of taking the heat off of him. Like, I'm not that bad. Look, Bill's getting money too, or Bob's getting money too. He didn't do that. Bill stood there and took it all. Bill never snitched. He took all that abuse while letting Dr. Bob look like a saint. So say what you want about Bill, but he was a stand-up guy, all right? Now, in Akron, the boss was Dr. Bob, and Ann was second in command, right? Or depending on how you talk to, it was the other way around. Then there was this other guy named Clarence Snyder, who Dr. Bob sobered up in February of 1938. He would be considered third in command. Clarence had spent his first year in sobriety doing exactly what Dr. Bob told him to do, which was to spread this message to as many drunks as possible. Clarence was from Cleveland, and by March of 1939, he was bringing 2 carloads of drunks from Cleveland to the Akron meetings. We're going to hear a lot more about Clarence in the next presentation, but for now we need to talk about his wife, Dorothy. Dorothy loved the multi-lith. She bought 10 copies from Bill, brought them back to Cleveland, and put them in the hands of as many doctors and ministers as she could. She started a crusade, trying to collect advance orders for the book from anyone, even the Cleveland Public Library. There were no buyers, though, but she certainly got the word out. She loved the big book. Now about printing the book. There are some myths that need to be debunked, okay? The first myth is that the printer held up the final copies of the big book until Bill Wilson paid for them, which is not true. The other myth is that the printer held up production of the book until Works Publishing first paid for the paper the books were going to be printed on. This myth is also not true. The printer Bill and Hank went to was called Cornwall Press. When Bill and Hank met with the president of Cornwall Press, they went over their plans for the book and their future goals with the hospitals and the paid missionaries, and that's why they wanted to self-publish. Bill said the Cornwall Press guy caught the AA spirit and wanted to be their printer. When it came to deciding how many books to print, Bill and Hank mentioned their relationship with the Rockefellers in the upcoming article in the Reader's Digest, and the president of Cornwall Press suggested they do a first run of about 5,000 copies. Bill and Hank agreed. According to Bill, when it came to the down payment, Bill and Hank offered only $500. The president guy was like, only $500? What about the whole Rockefeller thing? He's rich. Certainly you got more money than that. But $500 was all Bill and Hank had. So the printer accepted the down payment as a good faith gesture. Maybe, I don't know. But he took the money. Now the real down payment was $794.66. That amount was written on an invoice found in Cornwall Press's archives. The invoice was from March 27th, 1939. That $794 may have been the only money left in the Works Publishing checking account, but it was enough to get the printing presses going. So with the book done and the printing agreement in place, Bill and Hank thought it would be a good idea to go visit the Reader's Digest and let them know that everything was ready to go. Bill and Hank drive over to their main offices, and Bill says that when they got to the managing editor's door, they were met with a puzzled look. "Well, Mr. Managing Editor, Bill said, "we're ready to shoot." "Shoot what?" replied the editor. "The article about this alcoholism cure, the book we've been writing. You had a guy come to one of our meetings in September. The guy said you were going to do an article on us when the book was done. And we're getting ready to print the book." "Oh yeah, that thing," the editor said. "Well, I brought it up with the higher ups, and they didn't think there would be much interest from our readers about a society of alcoholics. So sorry for that telling you guys sooner. My bad. It ain't happening." And that was that. The linchpin of all of Hank's sales pitches for getting people to buy stock in Work Publishing all hinged on the national publicity they'd received from Reader's Digest. And now it wasn't going to happen. But even with this news about the Reader's Digest article, Cornwall Press still gave the okay for them to print. And 5,000 copies of the book Alcoholics Anonymous would sit for over a year in Cornwall Press with no certainty they'd be sold. As all the multilith edits and suggestions came in, Bill, Hank, and Ruth started putting those edits into a final copy, a master copy multilith. The master copy, now referred to as the original working manuscript of this book printed here, was published in 2010 under the name The Book That Started It All, the original working manuscript of Alcoholics Anonymous. The book is published by Hazelton. However, there is no proof. The book's been studied, it's been researched, and there is no proof that the Hazelton copy is the printer's copy, despite printer's copy being written on the binding somewhere when purchased at auction in 2004. I don't know if you guys remember that auction, but geez, that was nuts. All right, on Wednesday, March 29th, 1939, 2 days after Bill and Hank made their down payment, Bill, Hank, and Ruth drive up to the Cornwall printing presses in Cornwall, New York. They did not have a typed final copy of the big book with them. Instead, they had a master copy multilith with crossed out sentences, rewritten paragraphs, notes in the edges, pages reshuffled, etc. It was pretty sloppy. When Bill and Hank handed their multilith over to the manager of the printing shop, he was not happy. "I can't possibly set type from these impossible to read, disorderly pages. Go back to New York, retype them, and come back with a final copy." But Bill and Hank desperately wanted to get started selling books, so they went into sales mode. They told the master printer that Bill, Ruth, and Hank knew the book front to back. They would stay in Cornwall and work with the printers as they laid out the pages, and Ruth would serve as proofreader, making any corrections needed on the spot, right as they came off the press. For some reason, the manager of the printing shop relented. He allowed the typesetting to begin. Now, it wasn't just Hank, Bill, and Ruth editing the big book as it came off the press. There was a fourth person who decided to come up and help. It was Dorothy Snyder, Clarence Snyder's wife from Cleveland. Dorothy happened to be in New York City that week visiting her sister, and it appears she and Bill Wilson were in contact with each other. According to Ruth, while they were up in Cornwall, Dorothy was able to somehow contact Bill, or maybe it was the other way around, and Bill asked her to come on up. Ruth also said that Dorothy was a lovely woman, warm, full of humor, full of laughter woman, and most men of class like good-looking, humorous women, and Bill liked Dorothy. It took 2 days to proofread all the printed pages. Bill and Hank argued over what should go in and what should be left out, while Ruth and Dorothy checked for spelling errors. The four of them spent the night at a hotel in Cornwall. Spending that night in a hotel may have added fuel to a fire that caused some unfriendly relations between a prominent member of the Cleveland AA contingent and a prominent member of the New York AA contingent, but all reports indicate that everyone acted on the up and up. Now, to pay for the hotel, Bill Wilson had to drive back to New York and ask Charlie Towns for another loan. Charlie cut Bill a check for $200 and told him to split whatever was left over with Ruth and Hank. After all the letters were set and proofreading done, the plates were ready, and the presses started churning out the book. According to the invoice given to Works Publishing by Cornwall Press, Cornwall printed 4,650 copies of the book for a total of $1,783.15. But Cornwall Press didn't bind all the pages into books. Hank made the down payment of $795 plus another $90 payment on April 10th to cover the delivery of the books, but that still left a balance of about $900, a large sum of money in 1939. So Cornwall produced 1,000 completed books binded to start and held the rest of the printing pages in storage until they were needed. This appears to be the catalyst of the rumor that Cornwall held the books until they got paid, but they were more than happy to produce 1,000 books to get Bill and Hank moving. So the first completed books were delivered on Monday, April 10th, 1939. The books did not come with the signature red and yellow dust jacket. Those were purchased separately. The dust jacket was designed by Ray Campbell, a New York AA member whose story, The Artist Concept, appears in the first edition. Ray was not paid cash for his artwork, though. He was given 4 shares in Work Publishing as compensation, right? Ray Campbell is also important to the Big Book because it is in his story where the Herbert Spencer line appears. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is a proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. When his story was taken out of the second edition, many people protested because they liked the contempt prior to investigation thing, so the quote was added to the Spiritual Experience Appendix. We all know where that today. Now we get to who owns the rights to the Big Book. When the first books were delivered, Ruth sent 2 copies of the book to Fitz Mayo in Washington, D.C., along with a check for $2 to go to the Copyright Office and register the books under the name Works Publishing Company. When Fitz turned in the copyright application on April 19th, 1937, he listed the owner of the copyright as William G. Wilson, trading as Works Publishing Company, and identified the author as William G. Wilson. But on April 14th, 1937, 5 days before Fitz filed the paperwork, Bill Wilson signed over his rights in the book to the trustees of the newly formed Works Publishing Incorporated. So, Fitz filed inaccurate paperwork. And when you add the lone copy stamp issue with the Multilith books and some other things with Hank Parkhurst later on, AA doesn't have a copyright to the first 164 pages of the Big Book. It's public domain. So now the Big Book is done. There we go. We've made it. I hope I landed the ship for you. Now this presentation was about the events that went into creating the Big Book. If you want to know more about what went into the writing, we have a raffle for a copy of Writing the Big Book, as well as a copy of the original working manuscript. So all proceeds from that raffle benefit central office. But what happens now that we got the book? Well, that will be in our next presentation. Thank you.